The Peninsula before written history. Let us imagine that we travel back thousands and thousands of years, so far back that the concept of Spain does not even exist yet. There are no kingdoms, no borders, not even cities. What we know today as the Iberian Peninsula is, in that distant time, a wild land shaped by glaciers, untamed rivers, and dense forests that seem to have no end. The climate changes abruptly, alternating periods of extreme cold with milder times, and the animals that inhabit it are very different from those we see today. Woolly mammoths, hairy rhinoceroses, enormous bison, and cave lions share the landscape with herds of deer and wild horses. In the midst of this imposing nature, the first human protagonists of our history slowly begin to appear. Around 1 million years ago, in what is now the Sierra de Atapuerca, some of the oldest known hominids in Europe left their footprints. They were not yet like us, but in their bones the story of our species was already written. They were small nomadic groups who lived from what the land and the hunt provided, who lit fires to protect themselves from the cold, and who traveled great distances following the animals that were their food. They left no buildings behind, but they did leave rudimentary tools carved in stone, which today speak to us of their ingenuity and their daily struggle for survival. As millennia passed, these groups became more skilled and organized. Their descendants, the Neanderthals and the first modern humans, inhabited deep caves and took advantage of natural shelters to protect themselves from predators and storms. In places such as Altamira, in Cantabria, or the Tito Bustillo Caves in Asturias, we find an overwhelming testimony of their existence. Cave paintings that, despite the thousands of years that have passed, still preserve the strength and beauty of something newly created. They are not simple drawings. They are fragments of thought, an echo of something we cannot touch, but that connects us directly to those ancient minds. Bison, deer, hands in negative. Images that may have been symbols of hunting, beliefs, magic, or something we still do not understand. What is certain is that, when contemplating them, it is impossible not to feel that those human beings, although they lived in a world so different from ours, already shared with us the need to leave a mark. For tens of thousands of years, the peninsula was a mosaic of constantly changing climates and landscapes. The ice ages covered the north with a white mantle, forcing animals and humans to adapt or perish. In warmer periods, lush forests and vast grasslands allowed new species to flourish. These changes were not slow on a human scale. They could occur within a few generations, and the groups that inhabited the peninsula learned to move, to change their customs, and to seek new lands in order to survive. This capacity for adaptation would be a fundamental trait for those who, much later, would inhabit these same lands. Around the 9th millennium before our era, something began to change decisively. Hunters and gatherers started to experiment with agriculture. It was a slow, gradual change that did not erase the previous way of life overnight, but it would eventually transform the way humans related to their environment. The domestication of animals and the cultivation of cereals marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was no longer necessary to constantly move in search of food. Now one could cultivate the land and raise herds. This silent revolution gave rise to stable villages, the construction of more durable dwellings, and the development of techniques to store harvests and ensure sustenance in times of scarcity. The Iberian Peninsula, thanks to its geographical variety, offered very different conditions depending on the region. The fertile plains and valleys of the south and east favored early agriculture, while the mountainous areas and the more arid interior maintained communities that continued hunting and gathering. This cultural and economic diversity, which at that time was born out of necessity, laid the foundations for a territory that would always be marked by the coexistence of multiple ways of life and thought. Neolithic populations began to leave behind constructions that went beyond the utilitarian. Dolmens and megaliths, such as those in Antequera or the Sierra de Barbanza are witnesses to an emerging social organization and beliefs that transcended the material. We do not know with certainty if they were tombs, places of worship, or community centers, but their very existence shows that the human mind was already seeking something more than survival. It sought meaning, a connection with the invisible, with the eternal. Meanwhile, knowledge was transmitted from generation to generation, not through writing, which had not yet arrived, but through words, gestures, and example. The elders were the living libraries of those communities, guardians of stories, hunting routes, and secrets to interpret the signs of nature. That oral tradition, although today lost in its details, was the seed of many of the tales and myths that centuries later would intertwine with the cultures that came from elsewhere. By the 3rd millennium before our era, the peninsula began to be part of broader exchange networks. The sea was not a barrier, but a path, and through it arrived objects, materials, and perhaps ideas from other points of the Mediterranean. Copper began to be worked, and with it more resistant tools and more effective weapons were made. The appearance of metallurgy transformed not only the economy, but also relations between communities. Whoever mastered the art of melting and shaping metal had a strategic advantage, and that generated alliances, conflicts, and more complex hierarchies. This process did not develop uniformly. While some regions adopted metallurgy and consolidated larger villages, others remained almost unchanged, with a way of life still dependent on hunting and gathering. However, even in the most isolated areas, contact with other cultures was inevitable, whether through trade, war, or population movements. The peninsula was slowly becoming a meeting place. Thus, when centuries later more organized civilizations appeared on its coasts, the territory already had a deep history, woven by generations who had learned to read the seasons, to work stone, to cultivate the land, to domesticate animals, and to build sacred places. It was a world that did not know writing, but that was full of symbols, traditions, and accumulated knowledge. That long period before written history was not a dead time, but an extensive laboratory where the cultural, technological, and social foundations were forged. Foundations that would allow the peninsula to integrate into the flow of the great ancient civilizations. What would come later would not be a complete break, but the continuation of a path begun long before, when the first human groups lit bonfires in the night to keep the shadows away. And it is precisely at that moment of opening to the outside world, when the coasts begin to receive distant visitors, and the peninsula looks out to the wider Mediterranean world, that our narration takes a step towards another era and towards cultures whose brilliance and mystery still resonate in legends. Phoenician and Greek Tartessos. As the centuries passed, that territory which had once been home to hunters, farmers, and megalithic communities began to change in a silent yet profound way. The coasts, which for millennia had served as both frontier and protection, began to transform into open gates towards a sea filled with routes, ships, and distant cultures. The Mediterranean, which united shores instead of separating them, began to carry to the peninsula sounds, aromas, and objects that did not belong to this soil. Among all those visitors, there were some who would determine the course of history in a definitive way. The Phoenicians. Originating from a place that we would now identify with the coast of Lebanon, they were extraordinary navigators, masters in the art of harnessing winds and currents, capable of covering distances that to other peoples seemed impossible. They did not travel to conquer, but to trade. Their ships, loaded with metals, fabrics dyed with the precious purple, and glass objects, would dock in bays and estuaries seeking contact with the inhabitants of the peninsula, who, in return, offered raw materials coveted throughout the Mediterranean: tin, silver, copper, and a variety of agricultural products remarkable for their quality. One of the settlements they founded was Gadir, present-day Cadiz, considered one of the oldest cities in Europe. From there, They created a network of exchanges that extended throughout much of the southern and eastern parts of the peninsula. But the Phoenicians did not limit themselves to trade. They introduced new techniques for working metals, more efficient ways of cultivating the land, and above all, an element that would transform human communication: alphabetic writing. With it, transactions, agreements, and the transmission of knowledge could be preserved beyond oral memory. Meanwhile, in the southwest of the peninsula, a mysterious culture flourished, one that even today is known more through myth than through archaeological evidence: Tartessos. Its territory would have been located approximately between the Guadalquivir and the Guadiana rivers, and it is described as a kingdom rich in metals and agricultural products, with a complex political organization and a powerful elite that maintained contact with the Phoenicians and other Mediterranean peoples. Ancient texts, especially those written by the Greeks, speak of Tartessos as a fabulous, almost legendary place where wealth seemed to have no end. The Bible itself refers to Tarshish, which may be an echo of that kingdom, as a land of ships laden with treasures. What is fascinating about Tartessos is that it combines the appeal of documented history with the magnetism of mystery. Its disappearance, around the 5th century before our era, still has no clear explanation. Some point to a natural disaster, perhaps a tidal wave or massive flooding. Others suggest internal conflicts or pressure from neighboring peoples. The truth is that, after its decline, much of its influence dispersed, but its name remained engraved in the memory of the cultures that came afterward. While the Phoenicians wove their network of ports and Tartessos maintained its splendor, another visitor began to arrive on the Iberian coasts: the Greeks. Coming from city-states such as Phocaea, the Hellenes sought new trade routes and sites to establish trading posts. They founded colonies such as Emporion, present-day Ampurias, on the Catalan coast, and left behind a legacy that went far beyond commerce. They introduced finely decorated ceramics, more precise systems of weights and measures, and an aesthetic conception of the world that would influence how the peoples of the peninsula understood art and architecture. The Greeks did not achieve extensive territorial control, but they managed something perhaps more enduring. They integrated into the cultural life of the local peoples. Through them came myths, forms of worship, and a vision of the sea as a space for exchange and adventure. Contact with these visitors transformed the eastern coast into a mosaic of cultures, where indigenous, Phoenician, and Greek influences coexisted. During these centuries, the peninsula ceased to be an isolated territory and became a node within a vast trade network connecting the Atlantic with the eastern Mediterranean. Through its ports came not only goods but ideas, forms of political organization, artisanal techniques, religious beliefs, and even agricultural innovations. What to some may have seemed like simple commercial exchange was, in truth, the beginning of a profound cultural transformation. The legacy of this period is difficult to measure in its entirety, because much was lost with the passing of centuries and successive invasions. However, in the place names, in certain archaeological objects, and in the maritime traditions of the South and the East, echoes still remain of those first contacts. The salty taste of the sea, the shine of worked silver, the geometry of a painted ceramic, all bear traces of that time when the peninsula opened to the Mediterranean like one opens a window and lets in a breeze filled with unknown aromas. If one stops to think about it, it is almost poetic to imagine how, on a southern beach of the peninsula, a local fisherman and a Phoenician trader might have exchanged a few words mixed with gestures, perhaps sharing a piece of bread or a glass of wine, without knowing that this small act was part of a historical movement that would forever change the destiny of those lands. With the arrival of these peoples, the indigenous communities began to experience a cultural fusion that, over time, would create more complex and dynamic societies. The world was becoming larger and, at the same time, closer. Each ship that arrived brought a part of that world, and each ship that departed carried away something of the peninsula. An exchange that, in one way or another, continues even today. But this scenario of coexistence and trade would not last forever. The riches of the peninsula, its metals, and its strategic position attracted the gaze of an emerging power that would soon set foot on these lands. And with them, the entire Mediterranean would enter one of the most decisive and turbulent stages in its history. Carthaginians and the Prelude to Rome. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula had already witnessed the passage of peoples who left indelible marks. The Phoenicians with their trade routes and coastal trading posts, the Greeks with their ceramics, their ideas, and their Mediterranean settlements, and the enigmatic kingdom of Tartessos, which had vanished, leaving behind only an echo of wealth and mystery. However, what was about to arrive would not simply be another episode of exchanges and coexistence. It would be the prelude to a confrontation on a colossal scale, a clash between two giants that would forever change the destiny of these lands. In the north of Africa, on the shores of the Gulf of Tunis, rose Carthage, a city born from Phoenician colonists and transformed into a maritime empire with ambitions very different from those of its ancestors. If the Phoenicians had been merchants and explorers, the Carthaginians had learned to combine commerce with an aggressive policy of territorial control. Their ships, agile and fast, dominated the routes linking east and west, and their ports bustled with the constant movement of goods: silver ingots, amphorae filled with oil and wine, fabrics dyed purple, ivory from Africa, cereals from Sicily and Sardinia. Carthage was not just a marketplace. It was a political and military mechanism capable of projecting its power across thousands of kilometers. The Iberian Peninsula, rich in minerals and with strategic coastlines, soon became one of their main objectives. In the times of Tartessos, there had already been commercial ties, but now Carthaginian interest intensified with a geopolitical background. Controlling Hispania meant securing the supply of metals and food, while at the same time having a base from which to challenge any power that might try to dispute control of the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian expansion was not improvised. It relied on settlements inherited from the Phoenicians, and on new foundations that were part of a broader plan for economic and military domination. Among those cities, Carthago Nova, today Cartagena, stood out, founded by Hasdrubal the Fair in a perfect location. A natural harbor protected from attack, easy to defend, and with immediate access to the rich silver mines inland. From there, mining exploitation, maritime trade, and troop recruitment were coordinated, many of those soldiers coming from Iberian peoples who saw military service as a way to obtain plunder and prestige. The relationship between Carthaginians and the indigenous peoples was complex. There were alliances based on common interests, but also tensions that would later be resolved by the sword. The moment that would mark the beginning of a new era was the arrival in Hispania of a family destined to enter legend, the Barsas. Hamilcar Barca, a veteran Carthaginian general, arrived with the mission of reinforcing control over the peninsula after the humiliating defeat against Rome in the First Punic War. He knew that Carthage needed resources to recover, and that those resources were here, in the mines and harvests of these lands. Upon his death, command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and later to the son of Hamilcar, a young man who, from childhood, had sworn eternal enmity toward Rome: Hannibal. Hannibal was not only a brilliant strategist, he was a charismatic leader, capable of inspiring soldiers from very diverse origins and of forging alliances with peoples who, until recently, had been wary of foreign presence. Under his command, the Carthaginian army in Hispania became a formidable force, reinforced by contingents of Celtiberian warriors, Balearic slingers, and Numidian horsemen brought from Africa. The training was harsh, the marches exhausting, and discipline was imposed with a firm hand, but the reward for those who followed him was the promise of plunder, glory, and victories. The spark that ignited the conflict with Rome in these lands was the siege of Saguntum, a city allied with the Roman Republic located to the north of the limit agreed upon between the two powers. Hannibal, aware that the confrontation was inevitable, decided not to wait and attacked. The siege lasted months and ended with the fall of the city, provoking the formal declaration of the Second Punic War. What followed was a military campaign that astonished the ancient world. Instead of confronting Rome directly in Italy by sea, Hannibal chose a land route that would take him from Hispania, crossing the Pyrenees, traversing Gaul, and daring the impossible by crossing the Alps with an army that included war elephants. That crossing was a marvel of endurance and audacity. Chronicles speak of avalanches, narrow mountain passes, and attacks by mountain tribes, and of how, despite enormous losses, Hannibal managed to reach the Po Valley with an army still capable of defeating Rome in such memorable battles as Trasimene or Cannae. However, while the world looked toward Italy, Hispania became the other great front of the war. Rome sent the Scipio brothers to cut Carthaginian supply lines, and here, among rivers, mountains, and plains, decisive battles were fought that would determine the fate of the peninsula. The Carthaginian resistance in Hispania was fierce and prolonged, but the Roman victory in battles such as Ilipa, led by Publius Cornelius Scipio, the future Africanus, sealed the end of Punic power in the region. With the fall of Carthago Nova, Rome not only took from its enemy a vital logistical center, but also inherited control of trade routes, the mines, and alliances with local peoples. The peninsula thus fell under the direct influence of a new power that would not be content to exploit its resources from the coast, but aspire to conquer it entirely. The Carthaginian legacy, although brief compared to what was to come, was profound. They introduced new military techniques, promoted the use of local mercenaries, advanced the systematic exploitation of mines, and created cities that would survive their fall, adapting to the Roman order. Beyond the tangible, they left a strategic lesson that Rome understood very well. Whoever controls the Iberian Peninsula holds a key to dominating the Western Mediterranean. From that moment on, the beaches and ports that had served for trade became stages for military landings, and the inland territories, until then fragmented into tribes and autonomous regions, would become the scene of a slow but relentless process of integration into an empire that would forever change their destiny. Roman Hispania. The fall of Carthaginian power in the peninsula did not mean an immediate change for its inhabitants, but it did mark the beginning of a transformation that, over time, would be so profound that it would shape the language, the laws, the architecture, and even the way of conceiving the territory. Rome had come to stay, and when Rome stayed, it did not do so as a visitor who negotiates or trades, but as an architect who completely redraws the space in its own image. At first, the Roman presence was limited to controlling the coasts and the most strategic cities, guaranteeing access to mineral resources and the use of the ports. But they soon realized that the peninsula could not simply be a warehouse or a naval base. Its mountains, its fertile plains, and its navigable rivers offered endless possibilities for an empire that needed to feed armies, finance campaigns, and populate new territories with loyal settlers. Thus began a process of conquest that would extend for almost 2 centuries, a slow and costly advance, since the Iberian, Celtiberian, Lusitanian, and Cantabrian tribes offered resistance that Rome, despite its tactical superiority, had to learn to respect. One of the most remembered episodes of this long road was the resistance of Numantia, a Celtiberian city that, besieged for months, chose death over surrender. The Roman chronicles speak with a mixture of respect and astonishment of that ending. Its inhabitants destroyed everything they could have given to the enemy and took their own lives so as not to be enslaved. Rome, which valued discipline and honor, recognized in these gestures a worthy spirit, although it did not stop its advance because of them. Viriatus, the Lusitanian leader who kept the legions in check for years with guerrilla tactics, was another of those names that history preserved as a symbol of resistance against the Mediterranean giant. Finally, after decades of campaigns and treaties, the peninsula became integrated into the imperial structure. Rome divided the territory into provinces for its administration. Initially Hispania Citerior and Hispania Ulterior, and later into more precise subdivisions that responded both to military and economic reasons. The Roman logic imposed order not only in the laws, but also in geography. Fortified cities, roads straight as arrows, and stone bridges began to appear in places where there had previously been scattered villages or irregular paths. Romanization was a complex and gradual phenomenon. In the cities, Latin became the common language, slowly replacing the pre-Roman languages, although many of them left traces in place names and vocabulary. Forums, public baths, and theaters became the centers of urban life, spaces where citizens could not only buy or negotiate, but also attend theatrical performances, public baths, and civic ceremonies. Roman law, with its precision and its ability to regulate community life, brought stability unknown to many peoples who until then had been governed by oral traditions and local agreements. In the countryside, agriculture adopted new methods. Rome introduced irrigation techniques, wider use of the plow, crops such as the olive tree and the vine in regions where they had not existed before, and a system of villages, large agricultural estates, that functioned as centers of production and trade. Hispanic products, especially olive oil and wine, were exported in large quantities to Italy and other parts of the empire, transported in amphorae that traveled along roads and rivers until they reached the ports. The Roman army, which in times of conquest had been an occupying force, became an integrating element. Many Hispanics were recruited into the legions and ended up serving in places as distant as Britannia or Mesopotamia. In return, they obtained Roman citizenship, a privilege that opened the doors to rights and benefits previously reserved for those born in Italy. This process of integration culminated in the 1st century, when the emperor granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, turning the Hispanics into full Romans. But Romanization was not only political and economic, it was also cultural and spiritual. The Roman religion, with its pantheon of gods and its public rituals, mixed with local beliefs, giving rise to hybrid cults in which, for example, an indigenous divinity could be identified with a Roman one because of their attributes. Later, the expansion of Christianity would find in the network of Roman cities and roads fertile ground for spreading, slowly transforming the spirituality of the peninsula. The Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, allowed Hispania to enjoy a period of relative stability for several centuries. The cities grew, the arts flourished, and the Hispanic elites came to occupy prominent positions in the imperial government. In fact, 3 emperors were born in Hispania: Trajan, Hadrian, and Theodosius. This fact speaks of the level of integration achieved. The peninsula was no longer a remote province, but an essential part of the heart of the empire. Of course, not everything was harmony. Social differences continued to mark daily life, and the more mountainous regions, such as the north, preserved for a long time customs and ways of life that were little affected by Roman influence. However, Latin, Roman law, infrastructure, and political organization left such a deep mark that even after the fall of Rome, these elements would remain and serve as the foundation for the medieval societies that would emerge. Rome not only built in stone, but also left a model of civilization that would last far beyond its direct rule. The Roman roads would become medieval paths, the bridges would remain in use for centuries, and Latin, transformed over time, would give rise to the Romance languages, including Castilian. The Iberian Peninsula would never be the same, and its destiny would be tied, for better or worse, to the historical currents that had been born in the Mediterranean. However, Roman splendor was not eternal. On the horizon, changes could be seen that would test the resistance of the cities, the strength of the walls, and the cohesion of the empire itself. New peoples were approaching, driven by migrations, wars, and hunger. and their footsteps would soon echo on the roads that Rome had built. Crisis and arrival of the barbarian peoples. For centuries, Rome had been synonymous with stability and order in the peninsula. The roads continued connecting regions, the ports maintained a constant flow of goods, and the cities displayed forums, baths, and theaters that reflected the greatness of an empire that seemed unbreakable. However, beneath that solid appearance, cracks were beginning to open, imperceptible to many, yet increasingly deep for those who observed the pulse of Roman politics and economy. The imperial administration, which had once functioned like a well-oiled machine, was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Wars on distant frontiers consumed resources. Internal tensions between generals and senators eroded central authority, and heavy taxes suffocated entire provinces. In Hispania, these signs of crisis could be perceived in subtle changes. The arrival of coins with lower metal content, the decline of long-distance trade, the growing insecurity on the roads, and an increasing number of peasants unable to keep their lands. The local elites, who in the past had seen Rome as the guarantor of their power, began to look more to their own interests than to those of an empire that no longer seemed capable of offering the same protection as before. And while Rome looked eastward, trying to contain threats in Asia Minor or in the provinces along the Danube, in the north and east of Europe, entire peoples began to move, driven by demographic pressures, hunger, or the push of other groups even farther away. The so-called barbarians, a name Rome gave to anyone living beyond its borders who did not share its language or customs, were not a uniform mass. Among them were peoples with a long warrior tradition, such as the Visigoths, Suebi, Vandals, or Alans, and entire communities traveling with families, livestock, and belongings, seeking safer and more fertile lands. Their arrival was not always an invasion in the classical sense of the word. Sometimes they entered Roman territory as allied federates, agreeing to settle in exchange for serving as defenders of the frontiers. At other times, they crossed the defenses without permission and established camps that would transform into permanent villages. In the case of Hispania, the crisis reached a point of no return at the beginning of the 5th century. Rome, weakened by internal struggles and threats on multiple fronts, could not prevent several of these peoples from crossing the Pyrenees. In the year 409, the Suebi, Vandals, and Alans entered the peninsula and began dividing the territory almost spontaneously. The Suebi settled mainly in Galatia, in the northwest. The Siling Vandals occupied areas of Baetica, while the Asding Vandals and the Alans established themselves in Lusitania and Carthaginiensis. It was a chaotic division, marked by fragile alliances and conflicts over resources, but it meant the end of effective Roman control in many regions. For the Hispano-Roman population, the change was abrupt. Cities that had lived under the protection of the legions suddenly found themselves without garrisons, exposed to plundering and to the pressure of new authorities. Peasants had to adapt to new systems of taxation or to handing over part of their harvest to lords who did not speak their language. However, the image of absolute destruction does not reflect the entire reality. In many areas, daily life continued with relative normality, markets kept functioning, and the new rulers preserved aspects of Roman administration that were useful to them, such as the collection of taxes or the use of Latin in official documents. The presence of these peoples in Hispania was not stable. The Vandals, for example, soon set out on a new journey. Pressured by internal conflicts and attracted by the riches of North Africa, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the year 429 and settled in the African provinces, from where they would later launch maritime raids that would threaten even Rome itself. The Alans, decimated by battles with the Visigoths, ended up merging with other groups. The Suebi, on the other hand, managed to consolidate a kingdom in the northwest that lasted for almost 2 centuries, although their power remained limited to the local sphere. But the people who would play the most decisive role in this stage were the Visigoths. Originally from the lands north of the Danube, they had entered the Roman world decades earlier, first as allies and later as formidable enemies, even going so far as to sack Rome in the year 410 under the command of Alaric. After a period settled in Gaul, the Visigoths were displaced by the advance of other Germanic peoples and received from Rome the mission of recovering Hispania from the invaders who occupied it. Led by their king Walia, they defeated the Vandals and the Alans, gaining prestige and, above all, the right to settle in the peninsula. At first, their capital was located in Tolosa, in the south of Gaul, but Frankish pressures pushed them increasingly toward the south, until, at the end of the 5th century, Toledo became the political and administrative center of their kingdom. From there, they governed a territory that, with ups and downs, encompassed practically the entire peninsula. The Visigoths adopted many Roman structures. They maintained Latin as the language of culture and government, preserved the legal system, and largely kept the network of cities and roads. Nevertheless, their power depended more on alliances with the local elites and on military control than on an administration as complex as that of Rome. The arrival of these peoples marked the closure of one era and the opening of another, in which Hispania would cease to be just another province of a vast empire to become a mosaic of kingdoms, each with its own interests, laws, and vision of power. The political, cultural, and social landscape became fragmented, but it was also enriched by the blend of Roman traditions and Germanic customs. From that fusion would emerge a new order that, over time, would give rise to a distinct identity, born from the union and the clash of worlds that, in another time, had regarded each other as strangers. And while Toledo began to consolidate itself as the heart of this new power, in the shadows changes were brewing that would once again alter the map of the peninsula in a drastic way, driven by forces coming from much farther away, guided by an impulse for expansion that seemed impossible to contain. The Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo. When the Visigoths established their capital in Toledo, the peninsula began to enter a new stage that, although built upon the ruins of the Roman world, had its own personality. Toledo, with its strategic position in the center of the peninsula, and its easy defense thanks to the course of the Tagus River, offered the possibility of controlling both the interior and the routes toward the south and the east. From there, the Visigothic kings would rule for more than 2 centuries, facing internal and external challenges that would test their ability to maintain a united kingdom. Visigothic power did not arise as a monolithic and stable system from the beginning. On the contrary, in its first decades it was fragile, dependent on pacts with the Hispano-Roman elites and on a warrior nobility that, although powerful on the battlefield, did not always show lasting loyalty. Unlike the Roman Empire, which had a centralized administration and an extensive bureaucracy, the Visigoths ruled through personal bonds, military rewards, and agreements with influential families. This model, effective for conquering and defending territories, proved to be more unstable when the objective was to build a lasting state. One of the most decisive steps in consolidating the kingdom was the conversion of King Recared to Catholic Christianity in the year 589. Until then, the Visigoths had professed Arianism, a Christian doctrine that denied the complete divinity of Christ and which separated them from the majority of the Hispano-Roman population, who were fervently Catholic. With his conversion, Recared not only achieved religious unity in the kingdom, but also gained the support of the Church, an institution that, at that time, had as deep an influence as any army. This alliance between the monarchy and the clergy was reflected in the Councils of Toledo, meetings that not only addressed religious matters, but also decisions of government, laws, and key appointments. Visigothic legislation, set down in works such as the Liber Judiciorum, was another of the pillars of its consolidation. This code, which combined elements of Roman law with Germanic norms, regulated civil, criminal, and administrative life in the kingdom. Notably, unlike earlier periods in which laws differentiated between Romans and Goths, this code applied the same rules to all subjects, helping to forge a common identity that transcended ethnic origins. In the military sphere, the Visigoths proved themselves to be a formidable power. Heirs to the Germanic warrior tradition and adapted to Roman tactics, they managed to hold external enemies at bay, such as the Franks to the north, as well as rebellious groups in the mountainous regions. Fortifications were reinforced, and key cities had garrisons that ensured control of trade routes and strategic passes. However, the Visigothic army had a structural weakness. It relied too heavily on the landowning nobility, whose private armies could be as useful for defending the kingdom as they could be dangerous for its stability if they turned against the monarch. Cultural and economic life under Visigothic rule was a mixture of continuity and transformation. In the cities, Roman urban structures were maintained, although with less monumental splendor. Trade never reached the levels of the imperial period, but it remained active, especially in agricultural products, wine, oil, and handicrafts. The currency, based on the gold trimissis, reflected an economy that was still alive, although limited compared to previous centuries. In the cultural field, the Visigoths were not indifferent to classical influence. In monasteries and episcopal sees, Latin manuscripts were copied and preserved, and figures such as Saint Isidore of Seville became intellectual references, compiling ancient knowledge and adapting it to the Christian world. Works such as the Etymologies of Isidore would be read for centuries throughout Europe, making Hispania a center of knowledge that radiated beyond its borders. But beneath that appearance of stability, deep tensions simmered. The succession to the throne was not fully regulated, and in many cases kings were chosen by the nobility, which opened the door to intrigues, conspiracies, and coups d'état. It was not uncommon for a monarch to die under suspicious circumstances, or for a powerful faction to promote the election of a candidate favorable to its interests. These conflicts weakened central authority and consumed resources that could have been used to strengthen the kingdom's defense. The last years of Visigothic rule were marked by growing fragility. Internal disputes coincided with the arrival of new external threats. In North Africa, the expansion of Islam had created a new political and military power, dynamic and rapidly growing, that would soon set its eyes on the peninsula. Geographic distance was no longer a barrier, and the Strait of Gibraltar, rather than a limit, would become an inevitable point of contact. Thus, the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo, which had succeeded in integrating Goths and Hispano-Romans, consolidating a common faith, and developing its own culture, found itself on the brink of a crisis that it could not resolve with weapons or with councils alone. In the halls of its palaces and on the towers of its walls, no one could imagine that the end would come so quickly and devastatingly, in an invasion that would erase in just a few years the work of generations. The Muslim incursion and the end of the Visigothic kingdom. At the beginning of the 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo was going through one of its most fragile phases. Internal struggles for the throne, fueled by a divided and ambitious nobility, had weakened political cohesion to the extreme. The laws and councils still functioned, the cities maintained their daily life, and the peasantry continued cultivating the land. But beneath that surface, tensions were accumulating that went far beyond politics. The economy was clearly deteriorating, foreign trade had diminished, and royal authority was increasingly questioned in peripheral regions. In that context of weakness, on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, a new power was emerging, in full expansion. Only a few decades earlier, from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam had arisen with overwhelming force. In a surprisingly short time, the Arab tribes, unified under the new faith, had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, extending their political, military, and religious influence from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. The conquest was not limited to a succession of battles. It was a civilizational project that combined military strength, efficient administration, and a religious vision that gave cohesion to very diverse peoples. In the Maghreb, the Umayyad governors had managed to subdue the Berber tribes, some by force, others through pacts that offered integration and spoils in exchange for loyalty. The southern frontier of the Iberian Peninsula thus faced a territory that was no longer divided among multiple tribal chieftains, but instead responded to a unified authority with enough resources to project its power beyond the sea. The decisive moment came in the year 711, when Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander in the service of the Umayyad Caliphate, crossed the strait at the head of an army that, according to chronicles, numbered around 7,000 men. The landing site, on the rock that since then would bear his name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, became the entry point to an irreversible historic change. The initial objective may have been a punitive raid or a limited operation to support a Visigothic faction opposed to King Roderick. But circumstances and the initial success turned that expedition into a true conquest. The decisive clash took place in the Battle of Guadalete. The sources, both Christian and Muslim, offer versions filled with legend, but they agree that the Visigothic army, led by Roderick, was overwhelmingly defeated. The causes of the defeat were multiple. Internal divisions that led some nobles not to attend or even to betray in the middle of the battle, the lack of cohesion among the Visigothic ranks compared to a more disciplined and motivated enemy, and Tariq's tactical skill in taking advantage of the terrain and the mobility of his cavalry. The death of King Roderick in the battle, or in the subsequent retreat, according to other versions, left the kingdom leaderless at the worst possible moment. After Guadalete, Visigothic resistance fragmented. Some cities tried to negotiate their surrender, arranging terms that allowed them to keep their properties or avoid looting. Others were taken by force. In a surprisingly short span of time, the Muslims advanced inland and took key cities such as Cordoba, Seville, and Merida. The arrival of reinforcements under Musa ibn Nusayr, governor of North Africa, consolidated the conquest, allowing the extension of control to Toledo, which fell without a major siege thanks to the lack of an organized defense. The Visigothic collapse was so rapid that for a long time, historians debated whether it was a classic military invasion or a series of submissions and capitulations motivated by the kingdom's internal exhaustion. The truth is that, in only a few years, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim rule, except for some mountainous areas in the north, too remote and difficult to control immediately. For the Hispano population, the change was radical, although not always violent. The conquerors established a system in which Christian and Jewish communities could maintain their faith and part of their internal organization in exchange for paying special taxes and accepting Muslim authority. This allowed in many places daily life to continue with a certain degree of normality, while new customs, languages, and beliefs began to blend with local traditions. The Muslim administration introduced changes in taxation, agricultural organization, and trade, revitalizing routes and markets that had declined at the end of the Visigothic period. The Muslim incursion not only transformed politics and the economy, it also profoundly altered the cultural landscape. Islamic architecture, with its horseshoe arches and elaborate geometric designs, began to appear in cities that until then had maintained a style inherited from Rome and from Visigothic tradition. The Arabic language became the language of administration and official culture, although the vulgar Latin remained alive in the speech of much of the Christian population, slowly evolving into new Romance forms. In just a few years, the peninsula ceased to be the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo and became another province of an expanding Islamic world. This change of hands did not mean the end of the history of the Visigoths as a people. Some of their nobles adapted to the new order, while others fled north to lead pockets of resistance. In the mountains of Asturias and Cantabria, small groups were beginning to organize who, without knowing it, would be the seed of a struggle that would last for centuries. The Muslim arrival was a turning point. The peninsula, which had been Roman and Visigothic, now entered the sphere of a civilization that would bring scientific knowledge, advanced agricultural techniques, a rich literary tradition, and a new way of seeing the world. Contact, blending, and also conflict would mark every corner of its territory. giving rise to a period of splendor and rivalries that would be forever imprinted in its collective memory. And so, while the ancient Visigothic walls were occupied by new garrisons and mosques began to rise over former basilicas, a chapter was opening in which power, culture, and religion would intertwine so intensely that their marks would remain alive for many centuries to come. The Umayyad Al-Andalus and its splendor. After the dazzling Muslim conquest, the Iberian Peninsula became part of a much larger territory, connected with North Africa, the Near East, and, through caravans and maritime routes, with worlds as distant as India or China. What for the Visigoths had been a closed and divided kingdom was transformed into a land open to influences, goods, and ideas that traveled without rest. At first, Al-Andalus, as this territory under Islamic rule came to be known, was governed as just another province of the Umayyad Caliphate with its capital in Damascus. The governors, sent from North Africa, had the mission of maintaining order, collecting taxes, and securing the routes. But that initial provincial stage would be disrupted by one of the bloodiest and most decisive episodes in the Islamic world: the fall of the Umayyads in the east. In the year 750, the dynasty was overthrown in Damascus by its Abbasid rivals, who not only took away their power, but also attempted to exterminate the entire family to prevent any attempt at restoration. From that bloodbath, only a young prince, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, escaped, embarking on a flight that would take him, after crossing deserts and seas, to the distant Iberian Peninsula. Abd al-Rahman found in Al-Andalus a favorable ground for his ambition. The tensions between Arabs and Berbers, tribal rivalries, and disputes over the distribution of land had weakened the authority of the governors. His arrival was seen by many as the opportunity to unify the territory under strong leadership. In the year 756, he proclaimed himself independent emir of Damascus, although not of Islam, and established his capital in Córdoba. Thus was born the Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba, a political entity that, although it recognized the religious authority of the Abbasid Caliph, in practice exercised autonomous government. Under the rule of Abd al-Rahman I and his successors, Córdoba began to transform into a center of power, culture, and commerce. Walls were built, urban infrastructure was improved, palaces were constructed, and the construction began of what would become the architectural jewel of the city, the Great Mosque of Córdoba, whose forest of columns and superimposed arches still today conveys the sensation of entering a place outside of time. The city grew, attracting merchants, artisans, scholars, and travelers from all over the Mediterranean. The emirate, however, was not free from conflicts. Internal rebellions were frequent, whether for political, economic, or religious reasons. Areas such as Toledo or Zaragoza, with a strong Christian population and mountainous regions difficult to control, rose up periodically against the central power. Abd al-Rahman II and his successors dedicated considerable efforts to quelling these uprisings while strengthening the army and expanding the administration. The great leap of Al-Andalus came with Abd al-Rahman III. At the beginning of the 10th century, the young emir inherited a territory fragmented by revolts and under the constant threat of Christian kingdoms to the north, as well as Viking incursions on the Atlantic coast. His response was bold. In the year 929, he proclaimed himself caliph, equaling his rank to that of the Abbasids of Baghdad and the Fatimids of North Africa. With this gesture, he not only broke any bond of submission, but also placed Córdoba as one of the three great centers of the Islamic world. Under the Caliphate, Córdoba reached a splendor difficult to imagine for its European contemporaries. The city, which came to surpass 500,000 inhabitants, had paved and illuminated streets, aqueducts supplying fountains and public baths, libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes, and markets where products from the most remote corners could be found. Spices from Asia, silks from Byzantium, African ivory, and precious metals from the peninsula's mines. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics were cultivated at a level that astonished Christian and Jewish visitors, many of whom came to Cordoba to study. The court of Abd al-Rahman III and later of his son Al-Hakam II was a hive of intellectual activity. Classical Greek and Latin works were translated into Arabic, philosophical and scientific theories were debated, and expeditions were promoted to obtain manuscripts abroad. The relative tolerance towards Christians and Jews, who could hold administrative positions and practice free professions, fostered an environment of cultural exchange that left deep marks. In this period, figures such as Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish physician and diplomat in the service of the Caliph, played a crucial role in foreign relations and in the protection of knowledge. The Caliphate was not only a center of knowledge, but also a military power capable of projecting its influence beyond its borders. Campaigns against the Christian kingdoms, sometimes in the form of devastating raids, other times as expeditions to reinforce the frontier, maintained pressure in the north. At the same time, Cordoba intervened in the politics of the Maghreb, supporting friendly factions and controlling trade routes. However, the splendor of the Caliphate concealed fragilities. The centralization of power in the figure of the Caliph generated internal rivalries, and the wealth concentrated in the capital caused tensions with the provinces. After the death of Al-Hakam II, the regency on behalf of the young Hisham II was taken advantage of by the ambitious vizier Al-Manzur, who turned his position into a power parallel to that of the Caliph. For decades, Al-Manzur led almost annual military campaigns against the northern kingdoms, achieving enormous prestige, but also exhausting resources and accumulating enemies. At his death, the balance was broken. Succession disputes, the ambitions of provincial governors, and external pressures caused the collapse of the Caliphate at the beginning of the 11th century. In its place arose dozens of small independent kingdoms, known as Taifas, which would maintain the cultural legacy of Cordoba, but without the unifying force that had made its greatness possible. What had begun as a province dependent on a distant caliphate had become one of the most brilliant states of its time, and finally, a mosaic of fragmented kingdoms. The material and intellectual splendor of Al-Andalus would remain engraved in the memory of Europe, and its advances would continue to influence long after its fall, even among those who had fought against it. And so, from the unity and absolute power of the Caliphate, the peninsula would pass to a time of divisions, unstable alliances, and conflicts that would completely reconfigure its political map. Fragmentation and Taifa kingdoms. When the Caliphate of Cordoba collapsed at the beginning of the 11th century, the Iberian Peninsula entered a stage of fragmentation that would completely change the balance of power. The authority that for decades had emanated from a single caliph dissolved into a mosaic of small independent kingdoms, known as Taifas, governed by warlords, influential families, or former governors who took advantage of the power vacuum to proclaim themselves sovereigns in their cities. Seville, Zaragoza, Toledo, Granada, Badajoz, Valencia. Each of these cities became the center of its own domain, with its own alliances, armies, and foreign policy. This division was not the result of a plan, but rather the inevitable consequence of a central power weakened by intrigues, internal wars, and the inability to keep the more distant provinces under control. What in the days of the Caliphate had been a well-oiled network of communication, taxation, and defense was transformed into a series of enclaves competing with each other for territory, prestige, and resources. However, in the midst of that fragmentation, there was a surprising cultural flourishing. The Taifa kingdoms, in their rivalry, sought to stand out not only with the power of arms, but also with the brilliance of culture, attracting poets, scholars, architects, and artisans to embellish their courts. Each Taifa developed its own style and its own way of exercising power. In Seville, The Abbasid dynasty turned the city into an important commercial and cultural center, promoting architectural works that transformed its urban profile. In Zaragoza, under the government of the Banu Hud, science and the arts were cultivated, and diplomatic relations were established with the Christian kingdoms of the north, exchanging embassies and favors. Toledo, with its strategic location in the center of the peninsula, became a hub for the translation and preservation of knowledge, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews collaborated in transmitting classical and scientific texts into Latin. But the wealth and refinement of the Taifas came at a high political cost. Internal division weakened their ability to defend themselves against the Christian kingdoms, which, to the north, were beginning to grow stronger and coordinate campaigns to recover territories. To avoid invasion, many Taifa kingdoms opted to pay parias, large tributes that served as a way to buy temporary peace. These sums enriched Christian monarchs and financed their armies, feeding a cycle that, sooner or later, would become unsustainable for the Taifas. The struggles between the Muslim kingdoms themselves were constant. Alliances were easily broken, and wars between Taifas were as frequent as pacts with external enemies. This instability was exploited by kingdoms such as Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, which launched well-calculated offensives to obtain strategic strongholds or demand higher tributes. Cultural and diplomatic competition could not compensate for the military weakness derived from this lack of unity. The situation changed radically in the second half of the 11th century, when Christian pressure intensified. The capture of Toledo in the year 1085 by Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile was a symbolic and strategic blow of enormous proportions for the Muslim world of the peninsula. Toledo, former Visigothic capital, and one of the richest cities of Al-Andalus, became a Christian stronghold in the very heart of Muslim territory, interrupting trade routes and challenging the supremacy of the southern Taifas. Faced with this growing danger, several Muslim rulers turned to a solution that would once again change the political map, asking for help from the Almoravids, a powerful Berber empire that dominated the Maghreb. The Almoravids, warrior monks who followed a strict interpretation of Islam, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the year 1086 under the command of Yusuf ibn Tasufin. At the Battle of Sagrajas, they defeated the Christian forces, temporarily halting the advance to the south. However, their intervention did not stop at military defense. They soon began to see the Taifas as decadent states incapable of upholding Islam against the enemy, and one by one, they incorporated them into their empire. The wealth and luxury of the Taifa courts contrasted with the austere rigor of the Almoravids, and for many citizens, this change was as abrupt as it was necessary to halt the Christian expansion. For several decades, Almoravid rule brought political stability and greater military coordination. Defenses were reinforced, administration was reorganized, and tax collection was unified. However, the same rigidity that had been their initial strength eventually generated resistance among the Andalusi population, more accustomed to cultural diversity and a less strict lifestyle. In the 12th century, a new power arose in the Maghreb, the Almohads, who preached an even more reformist vision of Islam. They displaced the Almoravids both in Africa and in the peninsula, establishing their capital in Seville and ushering in a period of great architectural and cultural growth, visible in monuments such as the Giralda. Their arrival coincided with a renewed Christian offensive that culminated in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in the year 1212, a decisive defeat that opened the way for the Christian advance to the south. The history of the Taifas is, therefore, a story of splendor and fragility. Their political fragmentation allowed for unprecedented cultural wealth, an exchange of ideas, and artistic sophistication that amazed visitors from all over Europe and the Islamic world. But that same fragmentation was their Achilles' heel. Unable to withstand organized enemies ready to take advantage of every internal division. Among the brilliance of their palaces and gardens, a fate was brewing marked by the loss of power and the constant need to seek protectors beyond the sea. Over time, Christian conquests, North African interventions, and internal instability would reduce Al-Andalus to a final stronghold, which would resist for centuries as a witness to an era that had managed to combine refinement and tragedy in the same balance. The first Christian kingdoms. While in the south and center of the peninsula the Muslim kingdoms flourished and the Taifas competed for power, in the northern lands, far more rugged and removed from the great routes, small centers of resistance began to form which, over time, would become Christian kingdoms. These mountainous regions, difficult to access and with a harsh climate, had escaped the direct control of the Muslim invaders from the earliest moments of the conquest. There, groups of Visigothic population, free peasants, and local communities maintained their customs and their faith, organizing themselves around chieftains and leaders who saw in the struggle not only a matter of survival, but also of political legitimacy. The foundational myth of this resistance is concentrated in the figure of Pelayo and the Battle of Covadonga. According to the chronicles, around the year 722, a small contingent of warriors led by Pelayo managed to defeat a Muslim detachment in the Asturian mountains. Beyond the historical accuracy of the account, this episode became a symbol. The idea that it was possible to halt the invader and preserve an independent Christian community. From that nucleus emerged the Kingdom of Asturias, with its first capital in Cangas de Onís and later in Oviedo, which consolidated itself as a reference of authority for the populations of the north. The Asturian kingdom gradually expanded southward, taking advantage of the weaknesses of Al-Andalus and repopulating sparsely defended territories. Under monarchs such as Alfonso I and Alfonso II, diplomatic contacts were established with the Carolingian Empire, and the construction of churches and monasteries was promoted. These buildings, besides their religious function, served as centers of organization and territorial control. The court of Oviedo, although modest compared to the splendid Muslim cities, became a cultural and political reference point for Christendom in the peninsula. In the Far East, the Pyrenees became the scene of another line of resistance and political organization. The frontier marches established by the Carolingians to halt Muslim expansion gave rise to entities that, over time, would evolve into the kingdoms of Navarre and Aragon, as well as the Catalan counties. These areas, initially linked to Frankish influence, developed their own political identity, combining elements of Hispanic tradition with Frankish and local contributions. Pamplona consolidated itself as the nucleus of the Navarrese kingdom, while Aragon grew around a mountainous territory that would extend toward the lowlands of the Ebro River. The advance of these early kingdoms was neither constant nor linear. Offensives were often followed by setbacks, and pacts with the Muslim Taifas were as common as military campaigns. The exchange of embassies, the payment of tributes, or collaboration against common enemies formed part of a complex political dynamic in which borders moved continuously. The Christian kingdoms of the north were not culturally isolated. They received influences from the Muslim world, adopted agricultural, architectural, and artisanal techniques, and participated in an exchange that went beyond mere religious confrontation. As the decades passed, the repopulation of reconquered lands became an essential strategy. Monarchs offered privileges, land, and charters to those who would settle in the frontier zones, creating communities with a certain degree of autonomy in exchange for their commitment to defense. This policy not only strengthened the frontier, but also stimulated the local economy and encouraged the settlement of a diverse population of peasants, artisans, and merchants who saw in those lands an opportunity to prosper. Political organization also evolved. In Leon, heir to the Asturian kingdom, assemblies were held in which nobles and bishops were consulted, establishing precedents for a more participatory political life within the monarchy. In Navarre, the strategic situation between Christians and Muslims turned the kingdom into a skilled mediator, capable of allying temporarily with one side or the other to guarantee its survival. Aragon, for its part, began extending southward and eastward, incorporating new territories and preparing the ground for future, more ambitious expansions. The Catalan counties, initially under Frankish tutelage, gained effective independence. Barcelona became the most dynamic center, establishing commercial relations with Mediterranean ports and acting as a point of connection between the Christian European world and the Muslim lands of the peninsula. Although political fragmentation was evident, the general trend pointed toward the gradual strengthening of these entities and an increasing confidence in their ability to contest territory from Al-Andalus. In this context, religious and military orders played a key role. Monasteries such as San Millán de la Cogolla or San Juan de la Peña became centers for copying and preserving manuscripts and refuges for Latin culture that would serve as the foundation for future intellectual expansion. The Christian faith was reinforced not only as a personal belief, but also as an element of collective identity that justified the struggle and territorial expansion. By the end of this stage, the peninsular landscape was very different from the early times after the Muslim conquest. The northern kingdoms had gone from being isolated redoubts to emerging powers with stronger political structures, growing economies, and a horizon increasingly focused on the south. The idea of a reconquest was not yet fully formulated as a unified project, but the foundations were laid. Populations willing to settle in new territories, a nobility eager to expand its domains, and monarchs who saw expansion as the guarantee of their authority and prestige. Meanwhile, in the south, Al-Andalus faced its own internal struggles and the constant weight of Christian military pressure. The peninsula was preparing, whether consciously or not, for a long process of advances, setbacks, alliances, and betrayals that would ultimately redraw it completely. The crown of Castile and the crown of Aragon. As the Middle Ages progressed, the Iberian Peninsula became a chessboard of power, where the pieces constantly changed position, and where the drive for expansion by the Christian kingdoms of the north began to consolidate more complex and ambitious political structures. Among all those pieces, two would end up dominating the game: the crown of Castile and the crown of Aragon. They were not states created overnight, but the result of centuries of wars, dynastic marriages, temporary alliances, and strategies of survival against a common enemy to the south and competitors to the north. The crown of Castile had its roots in the Kingdom of Leon, heir to the early Kingdom of Asturias. Throughout the 11th century, the County of Castile, which had arisen as a military frontier against Al-Andalus, gained independence and strength thanks to its own counts. The union of Leon and Castile at different moments, sometimes through inheritance, other times through conquest, shaped a kingdom that combined vast and fertile inland territories with a growing Atlantic orientation. Burgos, Toledo, and later Seville would become key cities in its political and economic framework. The Castilian expansion was not purely military. It was accompanied by an intense effort of repopulation, which granted charters and privileges to those who settled in newly conquered areas. This allowed territories to be integrated quickly and ensured their defense. The system of local councils, with participation from neighbors in local decisions, and the role of the military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, played a fundamental role in the advance to the south, securing castles, fields, and routes. The crown of Aragon, for its part, had a very different character. Born from the union between the small Pyrenean kingdom of Aragon and the Catalan counties, it from the beginning formed a power with two souls: the mountainous and warrior spirit of Aragon, and the maritime and mercantile spirit of Catalonia. While Castile projected itself mainly toward the interior and the frontier with the Muslims, Aragon looked toward the Mediterranean. Barcelona, Valencia, and Zaragoza became nerve centers of a political network that, in addition to fighting for peninsular lands, extended its ambitions toward Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even territories in Greece. The political structure of Aragon was more based on pacts than that of Castile. The regional laws and the representative assemblies had great influence, and the monarch's power was limited by commitments with the nobility and the cities. In practice, the Crown of Aragon functioned as a confederation of territories, each with its own laws and institutions, united under a single sovereign but maintaining broad autonomy. This model allowed it to adapt to the cultural and linguistic diversity of its domains, although it also complicated quick decision-making in times of crisis. Contact between the two crowns was constant and not always friendly. There were wars for control of border territories such as Mercia, dynastic disputes, and differences in foreign policy. However, there were also moments of collaboration in the face of common threats. During the campaigns against Islam, Castilians and Aragonese could be found as allies on the battlefield, although only a few decades later they might be confronting each other over a port or a valley. Culturally, each crown developed a personality shaped by its external contacts. Castile, with its expansion to the south, absorbed influences from Al-Andalus, from irrigation techniques to Mudejar architectural styles, integrating them into a Christian framework. Its position also made it a bridge toward the Atlantic, from where news and goods from routes beyond Europe began to arrive. Aragon, on the other hand, was nourished by its Mediterranean trade, in which goods, languages, and religions from Italy, Byzantium, and North Africa coexisted. Literature and art flourished in both crowns, but with nuances. In Castile, the cantigas, royal chronicles, and epic poems such as the Song of the Cid fostered an epic spirit tied to the frontier struggle. In Aragon and Catalonia, the troubadour tradition, inherited from Occitania, gave special prominence to courtly poetry and works in the vernacular language. Both currents, though different, shared a common spirit, that of consolidating a political and cultural identity in the face of a constantly changing world. The economy also marked differences. Castile, with vast expanses of pasture, developed a powerful wool industry organized around the Mesta, an institution that regulated transhumant grazing and came to have considerable power. The export of fine wool to the looms of Flanders and Italy became one of the kingdom's economic engines. Aragon, for its part, combined irrigated agriculture in areas such as Valencia with active maritime trade, which included the export of wine, oil, and salt, as well as the import of spices, silk, and luxury goods. By the end of the Middle Ages, the rivalry and differences between the crowns were still alive, but destiny would end up intertwining them in a definitive way. Strategic marriages and the need to consolidate the peninsula in the face of common enemies paved the way toward a dynastic union that would forever transform the history of Spain. Before reaching that point, both crowns would have to overcome internal conflicts, tensions with their neighbors, and a period of deep political transformations that would prepare the ground for the construction of a more centralized power. On that horizon, the fortresses, ports, and courts of Castile and Aragon would be the key pieces of a game already being played with the goal of total control of the peninsula, but also with the projection toward seas and territories that until then had seemed distant and unreachable. The taking of Granada and the dynastic union. At the end of the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a map in which the two great crowns, Castile and Aragon, set the pace of politics and war. Around them, small kingdoms and lordships still maintained their own identity, but the real weight fell on those two powers. However, rivalry, divergent interests, and disputes over border territories still lingered. It seemed difficult to imagine that they could move in a coordinated way toward the same objective. And yet, circumstances and political skill would eventually weave a bond that would not only seal the union of their destinies, but also mark the beginning of a new chapter for the peninsula and for the entire world. The key to that union was the marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Both belonged to different branches of royalty, and their wedding, celebrated in the year 1469 in Valladolid, was not a simple romantic act, but a movement calculated with precision. Isabella, sister of King Henry IV of Castile, had to navigate intrigues and alliances to secure her right to the throne, while Ferdinand, son of King John II of Aragon, represented the opportunity to unite under one family two powerful kingdoms. The union was initially the object of suspicion and opposition, but over time it proved to be one of the masterstrokes of peninsular politics. Despite their marriage, Castile and Aragon did not merge into a single kingdom. Each retained its own laws, institutions, and customs, but the presence of the same monarchs on both thrones allowed coordination of foreign policies and military strategies. It was a personal union, not a legal one, but with a symbolic and practical strength that completely altered the balance of power in the peninsula. In the south, Muslim presence was reduced to the Nasrid kingdom of Granada. For more than 2 centuries, this Taifa-turned kingdom had survived thanks to a combination of diplomatic skill, tribute payments to Castile, and the exploitation of divisions among the Christian kingdoms. Granada was a prosperous territory, with a network of fortified cities, a flourishing agricultural economy thanks to advanced irrigation systems, and an active trade that connected it with the Maghreb. However, its internal stability was fragile, with frequent dynastic disputes that weakened its defensive capacity. Isabella and Ferdinand saw in Granada the opportunity to complete the long process of Christian expansion begun centuries earlier. It was not only a military matter, but also an act of political legitimization, to unite their subjects around a common cause, to reinforce their authority, and to project to Europe the image of powerful and determined monarchs. The campaign began in the year 1482 and lasted for a decade, alternating prolonged sieges, negotiations, swift incursions, and a careful strategy to isolate Granada from possible external allies. The military operations were carried out with a level of planning unusual for the time. Castile provided the bulk of the land forces, while Aragon, with its naval experience and Mediterranean diplomatic network, ensured control of maritime routes and blocked aid from North Africa. Each city that fell was fortified and repopulated with loyal subjects to the crown, thus ensuring that the conquered territory could not return to Muslim hands. One of the most emblematic episodes of the campaign was the siege of Malaga in the year 1487, a fierce confrontation in which the city's resistance led to exemplary punishment. Its population was partially expelled or reduced to servitude. Such actions, although harsh, sent a clear message to the rest of the Granadan strongholds. The war would be relentless and surrender inevitable. The final phase focused on the city of Granada itself. For months, the Christian forces cut off supplies, built permanent camps, and even erected a fortified city, Santa Fe, to secure the siege. Emir Boabdil, trapped between external pressure and internal struggles, tried to negotiate, but the conditions of the Catholic monarchs were clear: total surrender in exchange for guarantees for the Muslim population, including the preservation of their faith, their customs, and their properties, at least initially. On the 2nd of January of the year 1492, Boabdil handed over the keys of the city to Isabella and Ferdinand. The image of the monarchs receiving Granada became an enduring symbol, represented in chronicles, paintings, and legends. The last Muslim kingdom of the peninsula passed into Christian hands, closing a historical cycle that had begun with the arrival of Tariq ibn Ziyad almost 8 centuries earlier. The conquest of Granada had immediate consequences. Politically, it consolidated the position of the Catholic monarchs as undisputed sovereigns of most of the peninsula. Economically, it opened new lands for repopulation and agricultural exploitation. Religiously, it marked the beginning of a policy of homogenization that, over time, would lead to the forced conversion or expulsion of Jews and Muslims, breaking with centuries of relative coexistence. That same year, another event would project the power of the new monarchy even further: the voyage of Christopher Columbus to the west, sponsored by Isabella and Ferdinand, which would open the way to a transoceanic empire. The year 1492 would thus be engraved in history as a turning point, not only for Spain, but for the entire world. The dynastic union and the taking of Granada did not mean the immediate fusion of all the peninsular kingdoms, but they created a solid base for a monarchy that could act jointly in major affairs. From that moment on, the horizon was no longer limited to the peninsula. It extended toward unknown seas and toward a new role in the international stage. The discovery of America and the global empire. In the same year in which the keys of Granada passed into the hands of the Catholic monarchs, an event seemingly unrelated to the mountains and plains of the peninsula was about to change forever the history of Spain and of the entire world. The figure of Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator convinced that one could reach Asia by crossing the ocean to the west, had spent years seeking support for his idea. He had been rejected by Portugal and by several European courts, but in Castile he finally found the opportunity he needed. Isabella and Ferdinand, newly strengthened in their power by the victory in Granada, evaluated his proposal with caution. The project was risky. The routes Columbus imagined had not been proven, and the investment was not small. But the possibility of opening a direct route to the spice trade, avoiding the routes controlled by Arabs and Venetians, was tempting. At a time when the monarchy aspired to project its influence beyond the peninsula, the expedition offered a unique opportunity. On the 3rd of August of the year 1492, 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera. The crossing, longer than Columbus had calculated, was marked by tension, exhaustion, and fear of the unknown. The crew, made up largely of Andalusian sailors, was torn between faith in their captain and the fear of being lost forever in an endless sea. Finally, in the early hours of the 12th of October, a cry from the Pinta announced the sighting of land. They had reached what Columbus believed to be the Indies, but which in reality was a continent unknown to Europeans. The return to Castile was met with astonishment. Columbus was received in Barcelona with honors, and the monarchs hastened to secure their exclusive rights over the new lands through treaties such as that of Tordesillas, signed in the year 1494 with Portugal, which divided the zones of exploration in the Atlantic and in the new continent. What at first had seemed like an isolated discovery quickly became the starting point for an unprecedented expansion. In the following decades, successive expeditions ventured into the islands of the Caribbean, the coasts of Central and South America, and later into the interior of those vast territories. Figures such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro led conquests that brought down entire empires, such as the Aztec and the Inca, integrating enormous expanses of land and resources under the sovereignty of the crown. The flow of gold and silver from America radically changed the economy of Castile, filling its treasury and allowing it to finance wars and political enterprises in Europe. But the impact of the discovery was not only economic. An administrative system was established to govern the new territories, with viceroyalties, audiencias, and a bureaucratic apparatus that answered directly to the monarch. The American cities, such as Mexico, Lima, and Santo Domingo, became centers of trade, culture, and power, connected by maritime routes that linked the Atlantic and, through the Pacific, reached as far as the Philippines. Spain had ceased to be a peninsular power to become the first global empire in history. However, the expansion also had an immense human and moral cost. Contact with the indigenous peoples caused an unprecedented demographic catastrophe due to diseases brought from Europe, exploitation, and wars. Critical voices, such as that of Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, began to denounce the abuses and to demand fairer treatment for the original inhabitants of those lands. Although the laws of the Indies sought in theory to protect the indigenous peoples, the reality in many regions was one of subjugation and forced labor. The arrival of American products in Europe transformed daily life in the peninsula. Maize, potatoes, cacao, and tomatoes gradually became integrated into the diet and the economy, while horses, livestock, and European tools changed the way of life in America. The exchange was not one-sided. but rather a complex process that irreversibly united both sides of the Atlantic. In political terms, the discovery and subsequent colonization reinforced the role of Castile in relation to Aragon, since the administration of the new lands was centralized in the Castilian crown. This generated internal tensions, but also cemented the image of a monarchy with worldwide projection. The fleets that departed from Seville and returned loaded with precious metals were the visible proof of this new dimension of Hispanic power. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain controlled routes that went from Europe to America, crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and projected toward Asia through the Manila galleon. It was a network of trade and domination without precedent, which required constant defense against pirates, rival powers, and local rebellions. Maintaining that empire involved a gigantic military, administrative, and logistical effort, which would eventually have profound consequences for both internal and external politics. The discovery of America was not, therefore, an isolated event, but the starting point of a new era. The Peninsula, which for centuries had been marked by internal wars and shifting borders, now became the center of an interconnected world. The wealth, maritime routes, and prestige that this enterprise brought strengthened the monarchy, but also exposed it to new challenges. What had begun with 3 ships and a dream of reaching the Indies had opened a door that would never again be closed. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, and that bridge connected Spain with territories and cultures that would transform its history forever. Golden Century and Wars of Religion. The empire built after the discovery of America and the conquests overseas placed the Hispanic monarchy at the center of world politics in the 16th century. The coffers overflowed with precious metals from America. Trade routes crossed unknown seas, and the banners of Castile waved over territories on 3 continents. However, the greatness of this moment was not limited to weapons or diplomacy. It was also a time in which the arts and letters reached an unprecedented brilliance, giving name to what centuries later would be known as the Golden Century. The cities of the peninsula became hives of cultural activity. Madrid, established as a permanent court in the time of Philip II, attracted poets, playwrights, painters, and musicians. Cervantes was writing the adventures of Don Quixote, while Lope de Vega filled theaters with comedies that spoke of honor, love, and everyday life. Velázquez captured the majesty and intimacy of the court with brushstrokes that defied the rules of painting. The mystical literature of Saint Teresa of Jesus and Saint John of the Cross opened spiritual paths that still move readers today. It was a period in which the word and the image became instruments to understand and reflect a complex reality. But this cultural effervescence did not develop in a climate of peace. Spain was deeply involved in the religious struggles that shook Europe after the Protestant Reformation. Charles I, grandson of the Catholic monarchs and heir to a vast territory that included the Holy Roman Empire, assumed the role of defender of Catholicism against the advance of the ideas of Luther and Calvin. The Battle of Mühlberg, the Imperial Diets, and the defense of Trent were episodes in which Spain presented itself as the sword of Rome, ready to preserve the unity of the Catholic faith. The imperial heritage of Charles passed in part to his son Philip II, who, concentrating power in Madrid, made the defense of Catholicism a priority objective of his reign. The war against the Protestants in the Low Countries lasted for decades, draining resources and men, while the so-called Invincible Armada, sent in the year 1588 against England, ended in disaster. Despite these setbacks, Philip II achieved victories of great symbolism, such as the Battle of Lepanto in the year 1571, where the Spanish fleet, allied with Venice and the papacy, halted the Ottoman advance in the Mediterranean. The political centralization under Philip II brought with it a more complex administration, capable of governing territories scattered across half the world. From the Council of the Indies to the House of Trade, institutions were established to regulate commerce, justice, and defense. However, The very magnitude of the empire meant constant pressure. It was necessary to finance armies, maintain fleets, fortify enclaves, and respond to crises in places very distant from each other. In the internal sphere, religious uniformity became an obsession of the monarchy. The Inquisition, which had already existed since the reign of the Catholic monarchs, intensified its activity to watch over orthodoxy, pursue heresies, and control the circulation of ideas considered dangerous. The Moriscos, descendants of Muslims converted to Christianity, were the object of distrust and, after uprisings such as the one in the Alpucarras, were definitively expelled in the following century. These measures were intended to consolidate internal cohesion, but they also meant the loss of communities that had contributed to the wealth and cultural diversity of the peninsula. While the religious wars absorbed resources and energy, life in the cities and the countryside of Spain was being transformed. The massive arrival of American silver generated a phenomenon of inflation that raised prices and affected large sectors of the population. The nobility maintained its status, but fiscal pressure and military levies fell largely upon peasants and artisans. Despite the difficulties, the image of the empire continued to be that of a hegemonic power, respected and feared throughout Europe. The Golden Century, with its artistic splendor and its war tensions, was also a laboratory of identity for the Hispanic monarchy. Literature, painting, and architecture served to project an image of greatness and legitimacy, while on the military and political stage, there was a constant struggle to keep united an empire that extended from Manila to the Andes. It was a time in which glory and exhaustion advanced hand in hand, preparing the ground for the first signs of a decline that would still take time to fully appear, but which was already beginning to be hinted at in the offices and on the battlefields. The decline of the House of Habsburg. The 17th century began with an empire that still appeared imposing on maps, yet whose internal structure was beginning to show deep cracks. Spain continued to control vast territories in Europe, the Americas, and Asia, but the accumulated wear of decades of wars, economic exhaustion, and internal problems began to weigh heavily upon the monarchy. The change of century also brought a change in the style of government. From warrior monarchs and meticulous administrators to kings who delegated power into the hands of royal favorites, trusted men who, in the shadow of the throne, managed the affairs of the state. Philip III, son of Philip II, was the first to mark this new stage. A pious man of gentle character, he preferred to stay away from the intrigues of government and entrusted power to his royal favorite, the Duke of Lerma. Under his influence, the court was temporarily moved to Valladolid, and a less warlike foreign policy was adopted, seeking truces and agreements to ease the royal treasury. However, this apparent peace did not resolve the structural problems. Debt continued to grow. The economy depended dangerously on American silver, and corruption spread throughout the administration. It was during his reign that the final expulsion of the Moriscos was carried out in the year 1609, a measure which, although presented as a triumph of religious unity, deprived large agricultural regions of an important part of their working population, further deepening economic decline. Philip IV, who ascended the throne in the year 1621, inherited an empire in crisis and entrusted the government to another famous royal favorite, the Count Duke of Olivares. This ambitious minister attempted to strengthen central authority and redistribute the tax burdens among all the kingdoms of the monarchy, but his reforms met resistance and fueled internal tensions. Revolts soon broke out. In Catalonia, the so-called War of the Reapers, and in Portugal, an uprising that would end with its independence and the enthronement of the House of Braganza. At the same time, Spain remained involved in major European conflicts such as the 30 Years' War, where its armies, once feared on every battlefield, began to experience humiliating defeats. The Battle of Rocroi in the year 1643 dealt a devastating symbolic blow. For the first time in a very long while, the Spanish tercios were clearly defeated. marking the beginning of military decline. Despite the difficulties, the court of Philip IV became one of the most brilliant artistic centers in Europe. The painting of Velázquez, the plays of Calderón de la Barca, and the poetry of Quevedo and Góngora flourished in an atmosphere where art served both for glory and for escape. It was a cultural splendor that contrasted with the reality of an exhausted empire, unable to bear the weight of its possessions without indebting itself to the limit. The last Habsburg, Charles II, came to the throne in the year 1675. His reign was marked by fragile health, internal disputes for control of the court, and the slow collapse of royal authority. Attempts at reform failed in the face of the inertia of an inefficient bureaucratic system, and a nobility more concerned with preserving privileges than confronting the challenges of the empire. American silver no longer arrived in the abundance of previous centuries, and when it did, much of it went to paying debts to foreign bankers. On the international stage, Spain found itself displaced by new emerging powers, such as France and the Netherlands, which were taking away its territories and commercial advantages. Losses in Italy, Flanders, and the Caribbean weakened its global presence, while social unrest grew within the peninsula. Charles II, nicknamed the Bewitched, left no heirs, and his death in the year 1700 opened a conflict that would mark a new chapter in the history of Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession. The decline of the House of Habsburg was not a sudden collapse, but a slow process in which imperial grandeur coexisted with internal fragility. Court ceremonies, festivals, and artistic magnificence offered an image of splendor, but behind that facade lay a monarchy increasingly unable to sustain its position in the world. The transition to a new dynasty was at the gates, and with it would come profound changes in the way of governing and in the very conception of what it meant to be Spain. The Bourbons and Enlightened Modernization. The death of Charles II in 1700 without a direct heir was like lighting a fuse in a powder keg. The European powers, fully aware of the strategic importance of the Spanish throne and its vast empire, rushed to dispute the succession. On one side was Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, supported by the partisans of a new Bourbon dynasty that promised reforms and centralization. On the other was Archduke Charles of Austria, backed by a coalition that feared Spain would become a satellite of France. The War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701, was not merely an international conflict. It was also a hidden civil war, as different regions of the peninsula aligned with one candidate or the other, with Catalonia and Valencia leaning towards the Archduke. The conflict was long and devastating. Battles were fought not only on the peninsula, but also in Flanders, Italy, and at sea. Finally, the signing of the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt in 1713 recognized Philip of Anjou as Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain, but in exchange for major territorial concessions. Spain lost its possessions in Italy and the Low Countries, ceding them to Austria, and surrendered Gibraltar and Minorca to England. Although reduced in its European extension, the monarchy retained its vast American empire intact, allowing it to remain a global power. The arrival of the Bourbons marked a profound change in the model of government. Inspired by the centralized structures of the French monarchy, the new kings promoted reforms to unify laws, suppress local privileges, and strengthen royal authority over all territories. Philip V abolished the fueros and institutions of the kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon through the decrees of Nueva Planta, imposing the Castilian administrative system throughout the peninsula. This measure, seen by some as modernizing, was perceived by others as an irreparable loss of historic freedoms. Throughout the 18th century, the Bourbon dynasty alternated periods of ambitious reform with phases of relative political inertia. Ferdinand VI maintained a policy of international neutrality that allowed for a certain economic recovery. His reign was a period of relative calm, during which the treasury was reinforced and improvements in agriculture and trade were encouraged. But it was under Charles III, crowned in 1759, that the Enlightenment found in Spain a monarch willing to apply it decisively. Charles III, nicknamed the best mayor of Madrid, promoted urban reforms that transformed the capital. Boulevards, monumental fountains, and public buildings were constructed, many of which still shape the city's appearance today. But his modernization was not limited to beautification. He reorganized the administration, encouraged the development of manufacturing, improved the road network, and implemented measures to boost colonial trade. Under his rule, scientific institutions such as the Cabinet of Natural History were founded, and education was promoted with a practical and rationalist approach. However, the reforms were not without resistance. More conservative sectors saw Enlightenment ideas as a threat to traditions and to the influence of the Church. Tensions erupted in episodes such as the Esquilac riots in 1766, when popular discontent, stirred by seemingly minor measures like banning long capes and wide-brimmed hats, merged with outrage over rising prices and the presence of foreign ministers. Abroad, Spain sought to regain prominence on the international stage. The policy of the family compacts with France led to participation in wars against England, including the independence of the 13 colonies in North America, where Spanish aid was key to weakening its traditional enemy. The recovery of Minorca and the temporary occupation of Florida were occasional successes, although they did not alter the global balance. By the end of the 18th century, the Bourbon monarchy had managed to modernize essential aspects of the state, but it had not resolved structural problems such as fiscal inequality, dependence on American silver, or industrial weakness compared to other European powers. Furthermore, the echo of the French Revolution began to trouble the Spanish elites, who feared that the reformist momentum could lead to deeper political upheaval. In the final years of the reign of Charles IV, the shadow of Napoleon and the revolutionary wind sweeping Europe would put the solidity of Bourbon reforms to the test. Enlightened Spain, with its advances and contradictions, stood on the brink of a period of upheavals that would once again transform its destiny. War of Independence and the turbulent 19th century. The end of the 18th century had left Spain in a fragile balance. On one hand, the Enlightenment reforms had modernized certain aspects of the state. On the other, the pressure of debt, the resistance of the most conservative sectors, and the growing international instability foreshadowed a turbulent future. The French Revolution had raised alarms throughout Europe, and the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had risen from general to emperor, transformed the political map of the continent. Spain, governed by Charles IV, and increasingly influenced by his royal favorite Manuel Godoy, found itself trapped in a diplomatic whirlwind that would end up erupting in the most violent way. The alliances shifted according to the interests of Godoy. At first, Spain confronted revolutionary France, but the naval defeat at Cape St. Vincent and international pressures led to a change of sides. With the Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain became an ally of France against England, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The gravest came in the year 1805, when the Spanish fleet, joined with the French, was destroyed by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. With this, Spain lost naval control and was left at the mercy of Napoleon's strategies. The French emperor, seeing the internal weakness of the monarchy, devised a plan to take direct control. Taking advantage of the movement of troops toward Portugal, France occupied strategic Spanish cities. The intrigues in the court, with Ferdinand, Prince of Asturias, opposed to his father and to Godoy, facilitated the maneuver. In Bayonne, Napoleon forced Charles IV and Ferdinand VII to abdicate, placing his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. But what seemed like a calculated move to strengthen his empire awakened fierce resistance. On the 2nd of May of the year 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against the French troops. The uprising was brutally repressed, but it marked the beginning of the War of Independence. From that moment on, Spain became a battlefield where regular warfare combined with guerrilla tactics, a decentralized and constant form of struggle that wore down Napoleon's armies. Figures such as General Castaños in Bailén, heroines like Agustina of Aragon in Zaragoza, and the resistance of cities such as Gerona became symbols of the fight. Meanwhile, in Cadiz, a city that had resisted the French sieges thanks to the protection of the British Navy, the Cortes assembled. In the year 1812, they approved the Constitution of Cadiz, known as La Pepa, a revolutionary text that proclaimed national sovereignty, the separation of powers, and individual rights. Although its validity was short-lived, it planted a seed that would germinate in the following decades. The war ended in the year 1814 with the French withdrawal, weakened by defeats in Spain and in the rest of Europe. Ferdinand VII returned to the throne, but instead of consolidating liberal reforms, he restored absolutism. The repression against those who had supported the Constitution was harsh, and 19th century Spain entered into a spiral of coups d'état, military uprisings, and ideological confrontations. While the Peninsula was torn between liberalism and absolutism, in America the colonies took advantage of the power vacuum during the war to begin their independence processes. Between the years 1810 and 1824, Spain lost almost all of its American territories, from Mexico to the River Plate. This was not only a territorial blow, but also an economic and moral one, which drastically reduced the global reach of the monarchy. The death of Ferdinand VII in the year 1833 opened a new conflict, the First Carlist War. The succession issue, stemming from the pragmatic sanction that allowed his daughter Isabel to inherit the throne, pitted the supporters of the most rigid absolutism, led by Charles Maria Isidro, against the defenders of moderate liberalism, who supported Isabel II. The Carlist Wars, with their strongholds in the Basque Country, Navarre, and the Maestrazgo, were bloody and prolonged, and they marked Spanish politics for much of the century. In political terms, the 19th century was an incessant pendulum. The constitutional monarchy alternated with periods of absolutism. The military became political arbiters through uprisings, and instability prevented the consolidation of a stable model. Industrialization advanced slowly compared to other European powers, concentrating in areas such as Catalonia and the Basque Country, while the rest of the country maintained traditional agrarian structures. The central decades of the century were marked by the reign of Isabel II, whose image deteriorated due to political fluctuations and palace intrigues. Finally, the revolution of the year 1868, known as La Gloriosa, overthrew her, giving way to a brief republican experiment and the arrival of a foreign monarch, Amadeo of Savoy. His short and turbulent reign was followed by the proclamation of the First Republic in the year 1873, an attempt to establish a federal regime that was drowned by internal divisions and conflicts such as the Third Carlist War and the Cantonal Rebellion. The Bourbon Restoration in the year 1874, with Alfonso XII, put an end to this period of chaos, establishing a political system based on the peaceful alternation between two parties, liberal and conservative. Although this system brought a certain stability, it concealed social and regional tensions that would soon re-emerge with force in the following decades. The 19th century left Spain territorially weakened, marked by the loss of its American empire, fragmented by internal wars, and still in search of a national project capable of uniting its different peoples and regions. The turn of the century was approaching, and with it new challenges that would put the country's resilience to the test. The Restoration and the disaster of 1898. With the arrival of Alfonso XII in 1874, Spain attempted to leave behind decades of political instability, military uprisings, and civil wars. The new regime, known as the Restoration, was based on a formula devised by Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, the peaceful turn. Two parties, the conservative and the liberal, would alternate in power in an agreed manner, thus avoiding coup d'état and ensuring institutional stability, at least in appearance. This system, sustained by political bossism and electoral control, allowed national politics to remain predictable for several decades, but it also excluded emerging forces such as republicanism, socialism, and nationalist movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country. While in Madrid this controlled bipartisanship was in place, in many rural areas, life continued to be marked by poverty, lack of opportunities, and a social structure anchored in inherited privileges. Alfonso XII died young in 1885, leaving his wife Maria Cristina of Habsburg as regent during the minority of age of Alfonso XIII. During this regency, the political turn continued to function, but the country began to show signs of internal tension. In Catalonia, industrialization had created a powerful bourgeoisie that demanded greater autonomy and economic protection. In the Basque Country, the cultural revival was joined by political claims that looked back to the historical regional charters. At the same time, cities were growing in a disorderly way, with belts of misery where social unrest was fed by inequality. Abroad, Spain retained an empire much reduced compared to what it had possessed a century earlier. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a few enclaves in Africa were the last vestiges of the imperial era. But the situation in these colonies, especially in Cuba, was increasingly tense. The 10 Years' War, begun in 1868, had ended without resolving the demands for autonomy, and in 1895, a new Cuban insurrection broke out, led by figures such as José Martí and Máximo Gómez. The insurrection coincided with a moment when the United States, after its continental expansion, began to look toward the Caribbean and the Pacific. The North American intervention in the conflict was decisive. The sinking of the battleship Maine in the port of Havana in 1898 served as a pretext for Washington to declare war on Spain. The confrontation was brief and disastrous in the naval battle of Cavite in the Philippines, and in that of Santiago de Cuba, the Spanish fleet was destroyed. The Treaty of Paris ended the war and forced Spain to cede Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, as well as to sell Guam and the Marianas to the United States. It was the final blow. The overseas empire, which had been the foundation of Spanish identity and economy for centuries, almost completely disappeared. The impact of the disaster of 1898 was profound. It was not only a military defeat, but also a moral and political trauma. The loss of the empire forced Spanish society to look inward and ask itself what role it could play in a world dominated by much stronger industrial and colonial powers. What became known as regenerationism emerged, an intellectual and political movement that called for profound reforms to modernize the country. Authors such as Joaquín Costa denounced educational backwardness, political corruption, and economic dependence, while the so-called Generation of 98, with writers such as Unamuno, Azorin, and Machado, expressed in their works the melancholy and disillusionment of a nation that seemed to have lost its way. Despite the trauma, the Restoration survived. The system of political turns continued, but it was increasingly eroded by the rise of new social and political forces. The labor movement, which grew under the influence of socialism and anarchism. The peripheral nationalisms, which gained strength with demands for self-government. And an army that began to see politics as its own sphere of action. The relative peace that the peaceful turn had provided was threatened by accumulated tensions and by colonial conflicts that still remained, such as Moroccan resistance in northern Africa. The 19th century closed with a Spain that had ceased to be a global empire to become a second-rate power, with an aging political structure and a society in full transformation. The cities bustled with new ideas. Factories began to change the face of labor, and in the streets it was evident that the new century would bring not only changes, but also inevitable clashes. Second Republican Civil War. The new century brought with it an atmosphere of mixed expectations. The young Alfonso XIII assumed the throne in the year 1902, in a country that, although it had achieved a certain stability after the disaster of the year 1898, was living with a fatigued political system and with cracks that were becoming increasingly visible. Spanish society was beginning to change. Cities were growing. Workers and trade union movements were expanding, and in regions with a strong cultural identity, such as Catalonia and the Basque Country, nationalism was gaining influence. However, the turn-based party system and the control of local political bosses continued to determine official politics, disconnected from these new currents. In this context, Morocco became the stage where Spain attempted to regain a certain international prestige. The military campaigns in the north of Africa, however, were a difficult and bloody terrain. The defeat of Annual in the year 1921, in which thousands of soldiers died, was a devastating blow for the army and for the image of the king himself, who was accused of supporting reckless operations. The so-called Picasso Report, which investigated responsibilities, pointed to high-ranking military officers and hinted at serious negligence, but these were never fully prosecuted. Internal tensions were increasing. The labor movement was leading increasingly radical strikes, anarchism was acting strongly in Catalonia, and regional nationalisms were demanding profound reforms. In this climate, in the year 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera carried out a coup d'état with the approval of the king, establishing a military dictatorship that promised to end the corruption of the system and pacify the country. During his first years, he achieved a certain stability, promoted public works, and reduced the conflict in Morocco. But the absence of political freedoms and the inability to modernize the economy and the state in depth eroded his support. In the year 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned, and Alfonso XIII attempted to return to the constitutional system. But it was already too late. Republican, socialist, and nationalist forces had strengthened, and the municipal elections of April of the year 1931 became a plebiscite on the monarchy. Although monarchists obtained more councillors in the overall count, the Republican victories in the main cities were interpreted as a rejection of the king. Alfonso XIII went into exile, and the Second Republic was proclaimed. The new regime, born with enormous popular enthusiasm, set out to modernize Spain in all areas. A constitution was approved that recognized advanced rights and freedoms, the separation of church and state, women's suffrage, and territorial decentralization. Reforms were promoted in education, the army, and land ownership. However, these reforms encountered opposition from conservative sectors, the church, part of the army, and large landowners, while for the more radical sectors they were insufficient. Polarization intensified over the years. After the first reformist biennium, the elections of the year 1933 brought to power a conservative coalition that slowed and in some cases reversed reforms, provoking frustration among the left. Tension reached a peak in October of the year 1934, with the workers' uprising in Asturias and the proclamation of the Catalan state by Luis Companys, both suppressed by force. The repression in Asturias, in particular, left deep wounds. In February of the year 1936, the victory of the Popular Front returned power to the left and reactivated reforms. But by then the distrust between the sides had reached dangerous levels. Political violence intensified, with assassinations and street clashes that foreshadowed a tragic outcome. On the 17th of July of the year 1936, part of the army rose up against the Republican government, unleashing the Civil War. The conflict, which lasted until the year 1939, was one of the bloodiest wars of the century. It not only pitted two sides against each other, Republicans and rebels, the latter led by Francisco Franco, but also divided families, towns, and communities. The Republic had the support of the international brigades and the Soviet Union, while the rebels received decisive help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The battles of Madrid, the Ebro, and Teruel were scenes of resistance and sacrifice, while the rearguard suffered bombings, hunger, and repression. The war was also a laboratory of atrocities. Guernica, destroyed in the year 1937 by German aviation, became a worldwide symbol of the horror of modern war. Both sides committed reprisals and purges, leaving a moral wound that would take generations to heal. In March of the year 1939, the fall of Madrid put an end to the conflict. The balance was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of dead, a ruined economy, and a country broken by hatred and fear. Franco established a dictatorship that would last almost 40 years, putting a full stop in the political history of 20th century Spain. Francoism, transition, and contemporary Spain. On the 1st of April of the year 1939, with the last war report issued by the general headquarters of Franco, Spain entered a new stage marked by imposed silence and fear as a political tool. The Francoist dictatorship was born from a total military victory and was built upon the systematic repression of any opposition. Thousands of people were imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. Entire families were separated, and the memory of the war became a taboo, a hidden wound that nevertheless pulsed beneath the surface. The first years of the regime were years of almost absolute isolation. The Second World War broke out shortly after Franco took power, and although Spain did not participate directly in the conflict, it maintained sympathies toward the Axis powers. After the defeat of Germany and Italy, the country was marginalized from international organizations and subjected to a blockade that worsened the economic hardship. Autarky, with its policy of economic self-sufficiency, caused shortages, a black market, and stagnation that plunged much of the population into misery. From the decade of the year 1950 onward, the international context began to change. The Cold War turned Spain into a strategic ally for the United States, which signed with the regime military and economic agreements in the year 1953. This broke the isolation and opened the door to the country's entry into organizations such as the United Nations in the year 1955. Little by little, the regime left behind autarky and embraced a policy of economic openness, driven by the stabilization plan of the year 1959. The decade of the year 1960 witnessed accelerated economic growth. Tourism transformed entire regions. Millions of Spaniards emigrated to Europe in search of work, and industrial development changed the landscape of cities such as Barcelona, Madrid, and Bilbao. However, this growth coexisted with the absence of political freedoms, strict censorship, and a repression that, although less visible than in the 1940s, still persisted. Opposition to the regime, formed by students, workers, intellectuals, and Basque and Catalan nationalists, gained strength, and the violence of groups such as ETA began to mark political life. In the final years of Francoism, the health of the dictator was deteriorating, while the country seemed trapped between unstoppable economic modernization and absolute political immobility. Franco had designated Juan Carlos of Bourbon as his successor, trusting that the monarchy would guarantee the continuity of the regime. But history would take a different course. Franco died on the 20th of November of the year 1975, and Juan Carlos I assumed the headship of the state with the image of an heir to the dictatorship. However, in just a few years, he played a decisive role in a major transformation. The Spanish transition was a complex process, full of tensions but also of unprecedented agreements. Under the government of Adolfo Suarez, the legal apparatus of Francoism was dismantled. Political parties and trade unions were legalized, and free elections were held in the year 1977. The consensus among very diverse forces allowed the drafting of the Constitution of the year 1978, which established a parliamentary monarchy, recognized a broad system of autonomies, and guaranteed fundamental rights and freedoms. The path was not without shocks. The violence of ETA intensified. The economy went through crises, and in the year 1981, an attempted coup d'etat put the solidity of the young democracy to the test. The televised intervention of Juan Carlos I, defending the constitutional order, was decisive in stopping the attempt. In the following decades, Spain experienced a period of democratic consolidation and social and economic transformation. Entry into the European Economic Community in the year 1986 accelerated modernization. Infrastructure expanded. The country integrated into the European sphere, and tourism consolidated itself as an economic engine. The Olympic Games of Barcelona and the Expo of Seville in the year 1992 symbolized a Spain that presented itself to the world as modern, open, and stable. However, recent history has also been marked by persistent challenges. Economic crises, territorial tensions such as the Catalan independence movement, and a constant debate about historical memory and the legacy of Francoism. In the 21st century, Spain has faced moments of uncertainty, such as the financial crisis of the year 2008, the impact of the pandemic, and the questioning of some of the agreements born in the transition. Today, Spain is a parliamentary democracy fully integrated into the European Union, with a diversified economy and a plural society that, although still burdened by old divisions, has shown a remarkable ability to reinvent itself and overcome crises. Its recent history is, to a great extent, the result of centuries of light and shadow, of imperial splendors and painful defeats, of internal tensions, and of a constant search for balance between unity and diversity. And so, after this long journey through centuries of battles, alliances, and intrigues, we have traveled together across the traces that have shaped the history of Spain. If this journey has fascinated you, leave in the comments which part surprised you the most and subscribe to continue exploring together the secrets of the past.